Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us at the RAS tonight to celebrate the launch of Professor Christopher Hancock's latest book, Christianity and Confucianism, Culture, Faith and Politics. I hope that you have all received the flyer, which offers quite a substantial discount, and if you haven't, then you can email myself or Matty and we can send it to you, or you can put a message on the chat and we can provide that to you during the lecture. As many of you I'm sure know, Professor Hancock is the founding director of Oxford House Research Limited. Historically, he's a theologian who taught at Cambridge and in the USA, and his work has focused in the last 20 years on culture, ethics, and religion in contemporary geopolitics. As an Asian specialist, he was Dean of Bradford Cathedral and helped launch the new China Centre at King's College London. He's currently visiting professor in the Department of International Relations at St. Mary's University, Twickenham. Professor Hancock has taught in many universities around the world, including China, and his previous book, also with Bloomsbury, entitled Robert Morrison and the Birth of Chinese Protestantism, was in 2008. Now, we are also joined tonight by Graham Hutchings, who will respond to Professor Hancock's presentation. And Graham is an historian and journalist. He's an honorary professor at the University of Birmingham and associate at Oxford University's China Centre. His latest book, China, 1949, Year of Revolution, was published in January this year. He was managing editor at Oxford Analytica for the best part of 20 years, and between 1987 and 1998 was China correspondent of the Daily Telegraph, based first in Beijing and then in Hong Kong. After that, I think both of them will be happy to respond to questions. And I would ask if you could use the chat icon at the bottom of the screen, and I will then relay the questions to Christopher and to Graham. So without much more to say, I'm going to hand over to you, Professor Hancock, to carry on with your presentation. Thank you.
Alison, very much indeed, and good evening, everybody. It's very good to be with you, albeit in this virtual way. Let me say first what a privilege it is to be able to address such a gathering for the virtual launch of my book, Christianity and Confucianism, Culture, Faith and Politics. I'm very grateful to the Royal Asiatic Society, of course, for hosting this event, and deeply indebted to Anna Turton, Sarah Blake, and the team at Bloomsbury T&T Clark for their patience and their help in what proved to be the book's unexpectedly long gestation. When friends ask what the book's publication feels like, I have at times replied, well, I suppose a little like giving birth to an elephant. No book, let's be clear, should be a word or a page longer than necessary. The fact that Christianity and Confucianism runs to just under 700 pages is because it could not, to my mind, have been any shorter. And thankfully, the publishers agreed. Before I begin, though, let me also thank my decades-long dialogue partner on matters Chinese, among many other things, Graham Hutchings, for kindly agreeing to respond to my brief introduction of the book and to joining me in the Q&A afterwards. So I'm going to speak now for just a moment, over 20 minutes. Let me begin, if I may, by reading a little of the preface, where I set the course for what follows, and this should hopefully give you a sense of the tone and direction that I take. I will tell you when I finish this quite long quotation. This is a story more than a study. It tells the story of a long and difficult conversation. At times, the two parties had ignored one another. Rather more often, too often, they cussed, accused, and fought. Both are to blame for the state of their disunion. Like warring siblings or a divorcing couple, they profess innocence and indict the other. The book is the story of this stormy relationship. It also tells the story of where it all began, in the hope that memory will heal. Time will tell. The story begins by introducing the two main characters, the founding fathers of great dynasties. It proceeds to relate 6 instances in history when their successors met, conversed, and clashed. Some of this story is well known, much is little known, with disastrous effects. Like casualties of inherited abuse or multiple forms of dependency, inheritors of this fraught history are innocent victims of others' culpability. It is only if or when we join up the dots of history, we understand the complexity of this legacy. History, like memory, can also heal. Denial is a great enemy of therapy. It takes many forms. Behind "I am not to blame" lies the lie "I am never to blame" and see things as they truly are. There's a denial of guilt and a denial of intention or failure to grasp motivation. International relations is now alert to this deep affective dimension. We study the mind of the suicide bomber. We examine denial of wrongdoing. We try to explain the abuse of power or corruption of position. Our story is full of denial and the acute complexities that brings. History relates and perpetuates dishonesty. No amount of history can heal the fundamentally deceitful and self-deceived. I'm speaking, of course, of the long, tortuous history of Sino-Western relations. I'm also talking of the source and legacy of the moral and intellectual frameworks, those mighty cultural dynasties which formed China and Christendom, Christianity and Confucianism. In chapters 1 and 2, we return to the founding fathers of those two dynastic traditions, Jesus and Confucius. Chapters 3 to 8 visit select instances, historical snapshots, if you like, when the dialogue between China and the West, and thence Christianity and Confucianism, intensified. My argument is that both China and the West have been indelibly affected by this exchange. Indeed, affected to a degree that we do not, perhaps cannot, maybe even will not appreciate. Coming to terms with history and memory can be intensely painful. Denial, evasion, anger, blame, distortion, threat, and corruption are tempting. Therapists expect this. Truth must be made attractive. I hope it is here with the attraction of fascination, discovery, and veracity, perhaps even the offer of truth and the scent of peace, rather than well-worn deception or denial of the possibility of change and reconciliation. The thematic chapters in part 2 and 3 will hold gems of historical wisdom for some, costly choices for others. End quote. I then go on to say how little China featured in my history degree in Oxford in the early 1970s. Since then, global historians and Historians of ideas in the West have been playing catch up on China's impact on Western culture, while Chinese academics have conversely been filling in the blanks on China's engagement with and debt to the West, including, as I will indicate later, to Christianity and Christian mission. My book is an exposition then of the interpenetration, the mutual formation of Western Christendom and Confucian China. I did not, I confess, set out to write such a book. I am, after all, not a professional sinologist. The project Bloomsley T&T Clark and I began was a more limited philosophical and theological comparison of biblical Christianity and classical Confucianism, a theme that I'd published on already. But when Xi Jinping began to say a few years ago, China does not embrace Western values, I found myself challenged to re-examine and in time refute that claim. So it is my book seeks to show in more ways than I for one knew that China has shaped the West and the West shaped China. If today China does not embrace Western values, then it's not because China doesn't know those values. Rather, it chooses to forget or deny them. And in the process, and this is crucial, is forgetting or denying its own rich, ancient cultural heritage and identity. Likewise, if or when the West projects otherness onto China, it's doing something China does not deserve and may take objection to. Let's be clear, the categories East and West, with an associated implication of clear cultural and physical boundaries between them, is palpably balmy. The new sciences of anthropology and culture studies militate against this artificial subdivision of human history and our necessarily and essentially hybrid cultural identity. Trade and travel, military campaigns and missionary journeys, snatches of music and slips of paper, silk, cloth, tea, porcelain, portraiture, poetry, and news have over countless millennia created the rich background tapestry of our one beautiful and interconnected world. My book is a humble contribution to recovery and celebration of that essential, and I believe at the present time, especially important truth. When colleagues and friends have asked me about the book, I've often found myself saying, I've tried to write every page so people will say, I didn't know that. Or perhaps a little more humbly, I've no idea how I ever presumed to give a lecture before. I have learned so much. Or I hope with a twinkle in my eye, I'm having such fun making connections I never knew existed. Joining up history and historical events, culture and cultural variations, Christian ideas and Chinese political ideologies has been for me a deeply enriching and satisfying experience. Now, it isn't a journey I could possibly have made alone. My Chinese readers and colleagues have been central to the venture and will, I hope, write an Oriental counterpart to my Occidental offering. I hope you take time to make the journey that I've made. Like an explorer of old along the road at a meeting of the Royal Geographical Society, the book tells the story of a journey of discovery. I went where I hadn't been before, and I hope very much that you will too. Now, for the remainder of my time, I want to focus, if I may, on 4 learnings for me from the book. These are very personal and may not be what you would take away, but I hope they provide a sense of where the book is, what the book is saying, and perhaps should say more loudly than it does to our beautiful but battered planet. Now, first, and I touched on this already, the multifaceted mechanism of cultural exchange. Point 1. Over the last 20 years or so, I've attended numerous academic conferences in China. When I began teaching comparative philosophy and theology at Peking University in the early 2000s, I had no idea that there were probably more than 40 other Chinese universities that had some kind of Christian Studies program, embedded in a host of different departments, all overfull with bright students and committed academics. Over the years, it's been my privilege to teach in many of those programs. Now, 3 events stand out that help to germinate ideas in my book. The first was a conference on, of all things, historical geography at Fudan University, Shanghai. Most attendees were from mainland China or Japan. Paper after paper tracked the cultural ties between medieval China and Japan. I had no idea until then how much maps and artifacts, traders and trade brought and taught in unthinking acts of cross-cultural encounter. My book tracks this process using what I call cultural archetypes, accessible, I hope, to specialists and general readers as thematic leitmotifs to unite and explicate each chapter's theme. So it is that porcelain production and the tea trade, sculpture and story, poetry, pain, suffering, death are used in the book to illustrate this multifaceted mechanism of cross-cultural exchange that bound and bind Christendom and Confucian China. Now, the second event was my very first visit to the philosophy department at Wuhan University, to many as prestigious as its counterpart in Peking University. For 2 hours, I was quizzed by a room full of faculty on the finer points of Thomist theology and philosophy. Why? Because they just completed a multi-volume translation of the works of Thomas Aquinas, finding in his thought resonances with Confucian and Taoist ideas, as had, of course, those early 17th century Jesuit scholar missionaries and Chinese Illuminati in Ming Dynasty Emperor Wanli's Forbidden City. The third event was a mobile conference on comparative literature that flew me from Renmin University, Beijing, overnight to Xining High on the Tibetan Plateau to deliver a paper on the religious experience of the poet Lord Byron, a distant relative. Oh dear. I knew just about enough to give the paper, like many academics. My Chinese listeners knew much more. Don Juan, Childe Harold had been translated decades before, were well known, were dearly loved. The poet admired as a mighty religious iconoclast and model of romantic freedom. Now, literature and translation play a big part in my book. T.S. and George Eliot, Dickens and Lin Zexu, Husserl, Proust and Ezra Pound, and many, many others are all part of my own epic narrative of cross-cultural exchange. What I had glimpsed in those 3 academic events became the vast terrain that I explore in my book. Second takeaway from the book, and more briefly, the compatibility of Confucian and Christian ethical teaching. Now, I don't want to spend much time on this. Others have been down this path before, not least those Jesuit missionaries I mentioned earlier. At the end of each chapter in the book, I look in detail at the text of the New Testament Gospels and then at the Confucian Analects to see what they say about the chapter's theme, be it God or Tian, heaven, humanity or truth, memory or right, suffering or death. Early in the book, I say some readers may find that this is a useful place to begin. I end, for example, chapter 5, entitled Character, Purpose and Morality, China and Enlightenment, Habit and Values, looking at the enculturated practical moral philosophy, which is classical Confucianism, and then at Jesus's ethical vision and instruction in the Gospels. As I pondered this material, I was struck again by the similarity between the golden rule of love, to which both Jesus and Confucius appeal in their different ways, and also struck by the durability of what they say. In the introduction, I quote Carl Jasper's account of them as paradigmatic figures who, when we go through the careful process of what I described as picture restoration, inspire and provoke in equal measure. Now, we may not agree with their every conclusion, but in different ways, they challenge us, I suggest, to look at how we live and love and serve and take ourselves in hand and teach and respect and effect change and order society. It's not surprising that for 30 years after the Cultural Revolution, China's leaders and intellectual elite engaged in a sustained exercise to understand the success of Christendom. The reason why there were so many Christian studies programs was because China wanted to fill its post-Maoist ethical vacuum and found in classical Christianity a compelling, culturally compatible answer. But there's one significant difference between biblical Christianity and classical Confucianism. The Analects and other Chinese classics have nothing like Jesus's teaching on agape love, that God-given, unconditional love for any neighbor. Confucianism is a sensitively constructed system of moral and ritual obligation. Christianity commends lavish gifts of unconditional love. It was this practical, inclusive love Christian mission brought and taught to China. And as one senior Chinese scholar friend said to me on its impact, we wouldn't be the country we are without Christianity. Not something you hear every day from secular Western sinologists. My third learning was the extent of China's role in shaping the mind and culture of the West. As indicated in the preface, after introducing Confucius and Jesus in chapter 1 and 2, chapters 3 to 8 unpack their theme against a progressive historical narrative. Hence, as I said, chapter 5 on ethics is written in light of the impact of Chinese thought on the 18th century European Enlightenment. Now, of course, that connection is now widely recognized, as is the West's passion for chinoiserie in the late 17th and early 19th century. Less well known is the comprehensive impact of sinophilia, love of China, on 17th century Britain, and its reversal after the failed Macartney and Amherst embassies to the Qing court prior to the First Opium War. Likewise, the role 19th century Protestant missionaries played as countercultural cultural intermediaries when East-West relations were again at their most fraught, and the stimulus this gave to a second round of sinophilia in early 20th century Western modernism. From US presidents to Impressionism, from Lin Xu to Charles Dickens, from Shishu theatre to Wagner, from Jane Austen to Adam Smith and Karl Marx, the book tells a story of mutual formation, if not always mutual respect, between China and the West. Why is this story not better known? Because I fear it has been diplomatically and culturally inconvenient. My last takeaway is what the book has taught me about the commonality of lived experience. In other words, it's technically a long exercise in historical existential hermeneutics. Or put another way, a cross-cultural study in how we see and read the world. Hermeneutics is the name given to the science of reading and interpreting texts that first emerged in the early 19th century. The term is now extended to encompass the multiple stimuli that shape our views of just about everything, from life and death to religion, culture, values, and indeed truth itself. Now, as a historian, as a theologian, as a philosopher, as a student of culture, I'm acutely aware of the way this now vast science of understanding lays hegemonic claims on most disciplines, and it cannot be easily ignored. My book tells the story of the growth of the discipline through to chapter 8 on sickness, death, and the afterlife, which I present amid mid-20th century existential philosophy and modern, or now post-modern hermeneutics. This is more than a professional obligation or indeed a private passion. The evidence demands it. You see, if Confucius was the father of the Enlightenment, and Kant the guiding star of 20th century China, the existentialism of French philosophers Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, and the enlarged hermeneutic vision of writers like Hans-Georg Gadamer, Paul Ricoeur, Jürgen Habermas, have exerted an immense influence on late 20th century Chinese philosophy, politics, and culture. But more than this, study of this material and its impact on modern China has confirmed for me how our existential issues of life and pain and suffering and death act as unitive, global, cultural archetypes. When the Analects and the Gospel speak then of sickness and death and the afterlife, as modern hermeneutics consistently remind us, they are heard or read through the same lens globally, our shared human lived experience. So at a time when China and the world are again at odds with one another, my book is an ironic attempt to remind us how much we have in common by simply being human. The genius, and I use that word advisedly, of classical Confucianism and historic Christianity is that both traditions invite wise reflection on ultimate reality and chasten us for the pettiness that thoughtlessly divides. So what next? Perhaps a companion volume on Christianity and communism, or a parallel study of Christendom and India or Persia, for there too, East and West, if we should ever really use those terms, have profoundly shaped one another. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Chris, and good evening, everybody. The first thing I want to say is what a privilege it is to be associated with the launch of Christopher's new book. And I say that not just because Chris is a friend, but he has produced in this study a work of great scholarship, of authority and elegance. And that in itself, as I'm sure you'll agree, is a fairly unusual combination. And he's produced a work on a subject of great interest and great importance. The interactions and relationships between two of the world's great cultures, the Judeo-Christian and the Confucian, or in shorthand form of the West and China. If you're of a scholarly disposition, there is some good news as far as Chris's book that I want especially to draw to your attention, and that is the bibliography alone is well over 120 pages. There's even better news if you're not of a scholarly disposition, and that is that Chris tells me he doesn't expect readers to learn the bibliography off by heart. Chris has already indicated that in treating of Confucianism and Christianity, of China and the West, he's not privileging these cultures above others. It doesn't mean, for example, that he regards them as more important than the Islamic or the Persian or the Hindu or the Buddhist worlds, each of them, of course, great cultures in themselves. It is rather, I think, that the study of comparative cultures is a subject one has to start somewhere, and in Christianity and Confucianism, there is already meal enough for several sittings, as I think you will have gathered from Chris's remarks. His work is meticulously researched. It's a remarkable study for its range and its depth. And this is true chronologically and thematically, that is to say, in terms of what its author refers to as archetypes, as themes, as motifs. So, for example, as he indicated, there are sensitive handling and treatments of the concepts of truth and truthfulness, of memory, right, and tradition, of sickness, death, and the afterlife, those topics and issues that have occupied the minds of men and women over the centuries so profoundly. And we are also introduced during the course of this narrative and storytelling to hundreds of individuals, philosophers, statesmen, mostly men, I'm afraid, artists, poets, musicians, associated with these archetypes and the transition of them from one part of the world to another, from one cultural sphere to another. Men whose ideas formed links in the bridge that spans what we are too easily accustomed to think of as two distinct, different, and sometimes antagonistic cultures. So here then, in this study, is cross-cultural history writ large. It's a huge piece of work of interest and value of itself. But again, as you will have gathered from Chris's introductory remarks, it's also more than that, because it is a book written with a mission. One that, as Chris indicated, amounts to a denial that a fundamental divide exists between the values, the truths, the experiences of these two great creedal worlds, and one that holds out, in his own words, the possibility of change and reconciliation. I want to repeat that phrase, the possibility of change and reconciliation, because I think it is a critical one and something worth thinking about, especially in the present day, for reasons that I'll make clearer in a moment or so. What I'm getting at here, I suppose, is that you don't have to be a close student of international relations. You don't have to be a news junkie to appreciate that China and the West do seem to espouse very different values at the moment. They do seem to insist upon those differences, and they definitely do conduct their relations with each other accordingly, rather than on the basis of a shared experience, of a common, indeed mutually formed platform of the kind Chris sets out in his study. So one of the questions that I want Chris to respond to in a moment is what he thinks it is that accounts for this disjunction, if that is what it is, between cultural history or cross-cultural formation and contemporary national identity politics. Can the chasm, if that is what it is, between the two be bridged? If so, how? If so, by whom? But before he responds to that, and in the tradition of asking him to deal with the second question first, I want to take him up on the central argument in the book, which is that China has shaped the West, and the West has shaped China in a multiplicity of ways over centuries of time, so as to create a hybrid yet authentic culture. To which my response is, has it created one or two cultures? If it is two, where are the frontiers drawn between them? Presumably these frontiers are fluid. Presumably they're rather fuzzy. And the degree of fluidity and fuzziness changes over time. The second issue arising, it occurs to me, accepting the hypothesis of mutual formation of the two cultures rather than exclusive or discrete or independent formation, which I think hardly anyone could agree was the case these days, are there not powerful, distinctive, sometimes well embedded, irreconcilable or contesting forces at work within what we know as Christianity and within what we understand as Confucianism? Perhaps it's the case that no amount of careful reading backwards or picture restoration, to use an analogy that Chris refers to in his text, can gainsay this, and we are dealing with, if not exact opposites, certainly points of serious contestation. Because it occurs to me that from a doctrinal point of view, and in terms of praxis, Christians and Confucians were encouraged to be different from those in their own societies who had not embraced the creeds that they founded. Was it the case then that the respective adherents of these creeds, i.e. those who called themselves Christians and Confucianists, had more in common with each other than the non-believers in their own cultures? Well, I'd like also to go back to the other question of the long-standing tensions between China and the West, because they are so apparent today and appear to have come into sharper focus with the leadership in Beijing of Xi Jinping, the president and leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Chris has masterfully exposed the ways, numerous they are indeed, in which the two cultures have injected vitality and wisdom into each other. So why do national politics, why do geopolitics seem to tell such different stories? Is it blindness on the part of the national leaders and the political figures in charge? Is it ignorance? Is it willful or other forms of ignorance on the part of those in power? Perhaps it invites us to consider whether the nation state, which is such a prominent feature of the political landscape, despite its many obituarists over the centuries, constitutes an inadequate expression of culture, and that it is a vehicle easily commandeered by politicians for the pursuit of narrow self-interest. If Chris's answer and the answer of others that might want to join the discussion on this theme is yes, that might perhaps hold out some promise, though not necessarily so. I think we ought to return, however, also to the subject of cultural history, because that is where Christopher has placed the greatest emphasis, and the matter of cultural borrowing and cultural lending between these two great civilizations. One of the strengths, as I've indicated, of the book is the way in which it reveals the complex warp and weft, if you like, of connections linking the two worlds. The baton is passed backwards and forwards across the centuries, dealing with different themes. Or to change analogy, seeds are planted which blossom in different but related ways in the two cultures at different times. The mechanisms of this we're fairly familiar with. It's trade, of course, it's military campaigns, it's what Chris calls the snatches of music and slips of paper that are transmitted between these two worlds. We must also, I suppose, before we get too far into thinking about bipolarity, is recall that the transmission between these two cultures was via third parties of other agencies. It isn't as if there was a direct connection. We're dealing with complex indirect relationships through several parties in these transmission links. So if we accept this thesis and delve into it a little bit further, we want to ask ourselves, I think, who amongst these two great creeds is doing most of the cultural lending, and who is doing most of the cultural borrowing, and at what times are they doing it? We might like to know the answer to that question. And we might like to know why it is that one borrows more than the other at various times. The other question, very much in my mind, as a historian of the post-war period, is the matter of power, of geopolitical power, full spectrum power, ranging across the military, the economy, the financial world, the cultural world, and so forth. And what the relationship is between those two great civilizations and their exchange and this bigger picture of power. Is it the powerful that does the lending and the weaker element that does the borrowing? We might also like to think about a counterfactual matter here, which of course is so popular these days in the academy. When one thinks about the interaction between two great civilizations over such a long period of time, or indeed even if it's a shorter period of time, we're very struck by the role that contingency plays, and that is an important factor in the matter of mutual cultural formation. And it's this question of power again in the round that strikes one as a key and critical contingent factor. The West has enjoyed greater power, broadly speaking, relative to China since about the 18th century, perhaps a little bit earlier, until, let's pick an arbitrary date, about the year 2000. China's global standing, growing as it still is, really began around that year. In the period when China was, broadly speaking, the weaker of the two, it was the West that went to China. Less often did China go to the West. And my question for Chris to respond to in this connection is, what might the world look like? What kind of book might he have been tasked with writing if the situation were reversed? The final topic I want to ask him to comment on brings us back to the main theme and indeed the title, or at least half of it, of Chris's book, and that is Christianity, and specifically Christianity in contemporary China. He rightly refers to the interest that Chinese academics have shown over many years now in the history of Christianity in the West, of its role in the formation of what we call the West, and with a view, I think, to understanding something of the secrets of the West's power. The Chinese Communist Party has been very much interested in that quest as well. We might note in parenthesis, incidentally, although I don't have any statistics to back this up, but I think it is quite widely recognized that more people attend Christian worship in China today than in any other country in the world. And if this is so, then this is a stark example of the cultural transmission that is at the heart of this book. A cultural transmission, in this case, whose earlier manifestations included the Western missionary enterprise in China. Chris might like to have something to say on that. And yet, when we think about the fate of Christianity in China today, we must accept that the faith is under rather serious degree of persecution, unless it is conducted within the fairly narrow constraints laid down by the Chinese Communist Party. So what is going on here, and how does it relate to the great themes addressed by Chris? Is much interest in the study of Christianity in China driven by the pursuit not of salvation, not of truth or truthfulness, as most believers understand it, by the quest for modernity, by the quest for power? Because contra Marx, Christianity, in common with religious belief generally, does not seem to fade away so much as form a foundation for social progress and modernity. And China especially the Chinese Communist Party, admires and envies that, even if it has two very big reservations, one about what we might call the metaphysics of Christianity, and the other about the growth in the number of Christian believers, growth at such a pace that it exceeds the boundaries of the permissible and escapes the control of the state. My final observation concerns one of the points touched on earlier about China's global standing and power today. It is plain that it's growing. If one thinks of the great movements and policies that have shaken China over the past 70 years, in other words, since the foundation of the People's Republic of China, whether it's the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the extraordinary embrace of quasi-capitalism since the 1980s, the Belt and Road Initiative, the list goes on. It's plain that China thinks that if a thing is worth doing, it is worth overdoing. So I think we ought to ask Chris to make a few comments, not so much about the past, but how he sees the future, and tell us whether he thinks China's soft power, so strikingly manifest across the centuries in the past, is going ever to be as formidable as its hard power seems to be. And if we might turn the screw a little, ask him to tell us what the answer means for the impact of Chinese culture on the West over the next few decades.
Graham, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I hope I'm live. I think I am. Sincere thanks for your thoughtful response. And before that, I should say to everybody, for reading my book in draft and in its final published form, I hope the fact that Graham has lived to tell the tale, having done all that, will encourage others to follow his example. Graham kindly shared the outline of his response with me last night, so I had a little time to gather my thoughts. Rather like an English batsman, though, in India today, to know that you're facing a fine spin bowler, some of whose questions spin while others go straight on with the arm, and that both can get you out, doesn't make my time at the crease facing Graham entirely risk-free or entirely comfortable. However, let me respond, if I may, to 6 of Graham's penetrating deliveries, an overfull, if I may, and from what he said, extract what I take to be 6 pungent questions. Firstly, this issue of the privileging of Christianity and Confucianism, and I would add, if you like, the necessary selectivity in my book. As I said at the end of my introduction, I can imagine a companion volume, a needed companion volume on Christendom and India, and facing, as such a work must, the full force of post-colonial criticism, stronger, it must be said, in the India Academy than in my experience, the Chinese Academy. Or imagine a substantial comparative study of Christianity and communism, of the kind that colleagues within the Chinese Academy of Social Science were commissioned to prepare in the very recent past. To my mind, if Chinese imperial aspiration and expansion persist, the fundamentally different anthropologies at the heart of the Judeo-Christian and the Marxist-Leninist or Maoist traditions will become central global choice. A Marxist unit of labor or a living soul. But I hope for now the choice I made and the multidisciplinary method I employed in my cross-cultural study of Christianity and Confucianism will encourage others that this dialogue and others is rich and enriching, and indeed the method I adopt replicable. Second response, picking up that word disjuncture, between my account of the depth of Sino-Western mutual formation and the sad fact of contemporary conflict or tension. Now, 2 comments in reply. First, as I said in my introduction, the story I've told is one that has, for a host of reasons, been, I quote, diplomatically and culturally inconvenient. And as I quoted from the preface in the book, denial is a strong human impulse. So the West, I suggest, has wanted to deny atrocities committed in the Opium Wars, while China has silenced its debt to Western science and Christian mission. And as I know from my track 1.5 diplomacy, the West has been, and indeed often still is, guilty of projecting its secular cultural values on host nations rather than working to understand other cultures on their own terms. And that leads to my second comment. Why the disjuncture between Sino-Western mutual formation and the sad fact of contemporary conflict? Because projected or convenient caricatures have shaped and continue to shape East-West, use those terms, relations. Can the chasm be bridged? Yes, by all who seek the common good and who seek deeper mutual understanding. But I don't deny the difficulty of doing this given our present starting point. Third, am I guilty of minimizing difference between Christianity and Confucianism, of ignoring those who are never signed up members of either tradition, or of privileging culture over realpolitik? You know, I'm quite sure some Christians and some Confucian scholars will take issue with my read of tradition that they hold dear. As I say and admit early on in my book, one of the key issues one faces is which Christianity and which Confucianism. Both are vast, evolving cultural traditions. The reason I end each chapter in a close thematic reading of the Gospels and Analects is to honor the textualism of each tradition, which is clear, and thereby to enable focused comparative analysis. And yes, Christianity and Confucianism never exerted comprehensive cultural controls, but few, I believe, would question their historic hegemonic claims. Likewise, as the fate of Jesus and Confucius over the centuries reveals, political ideology has variously changed and challenged and co-opted and compromised their socio-political status. Fourth, ball in the over. In the encounter between these two worlds, who does most of the cultural borrowing and who most of the cultural lending? Now, as I said again in my introduction, I'm very aware of the potential, if not the inevitable Occidentalism of my work, and look forward to Chinese colleagues and friends writing an Oriental counterpart to my study. But that said, to the best of my ability, answering Graham's question, I have tried not to permit trade winds of cultural influence to be seen to blow consistently in one direction. I don't believe they did at any stage. But as Graham's question notes, cultural influence was certainly affected by the state of East-West diplomatic relations. Yes, but remember, when Sinophilia turned to Sinophobia, or, as I say in the book, studied disregard for China in the mid-19th century onwards, it was surprisingly perhaps those countercultural Protestant missionaries who kindled the flame of respect and love for China and Chinese culture, which in time bore fruit in its unlikely offspring, Orientalist, Western modernism, as chapter 7 of the book unpacks. And that is the point when China again, certainly to use Graham's words, went west. But it was doing so in different ways, more or less consistently. Fifth, nearly done, Graham has asked about the state and rationale of contemporary Chinese Christianity and their relation to my story of mutual East-West cultural formation. Well, yes, the Chinese church in all its public and private forms probably is the largest Christian community in the world today. And yes, in part, membership of that community has, as you suggested, represented for some, since the end of the Cultural Revolution, a socio-political quest to embrace and be seen to embrace progressive, modern, aspirational, global values, particularly among China's enlightened urban youth and elites. And yes, under Xi Jinping, freedoms that the majority of Chinese enjoyed since the late 1970s have been lost in this so-called second cultural revolution that is being imposed on China's citizens and the rest of the world today. But let's be clear, it was China and Chinese who ignited the fires of Christianity in China today, not Western imperialist missionaries. The decision to send just under 400,000 of China's brightest and best to the West for study in the 1980s opened the door to new spiritual winds. Simply put, China converted itself, or better, allowed itself to recover, I would argue, a cultural identity that was as deeply embedded there as in Britain and Europe. Remember, Bishop Alapin's famous arrival in Chang'an in AD 635, which for some was the first coming of Christianity to China, although there is evidence of Christian presence, perhaps going back to the Thomas mission in the first century that went on from India to China. But that arrival in 635 was in the same year that Adam founded the monastery at Lindisfarne. Christianity in China is not a Johnny-come-lately to the Chinese party. It's deeply embedded, no matter what has been said centrally. Sixth, and very briefly, how effective will China's soft power be in coming decades? I think my answer is probably, Graham, not very. China is usually far better at copying than creating. But when it comes to soft power, it's been slow to recognize how few, apart from for financial reasons, want to embrace or to be embraced by modern Chinese culture. Hospitals in Africa, maybe, hundreds of thousands of scholarships to study in China, maybe. They have, I believe, done little but confirm the opportunistic acquisitiveness of a materialist world. Simply put, you can neither buy love nor respect. Why study Christianity and classical Confucianism? Because they commend deeper values both to China and to the rest of the world. But thank you, Ren.
Thank you, Chris. I think this is the point at which we hand the reins back to Alison.
Yes, I was just wondering if there are, and I'll just switch on my video, sorry. I was just wondering if there are any questions from the audience. Thank you both very much for a very full discussion there. It's very interesting and very thought-provoking. If I may, I will start off with one question. And I was just wondering if there has been any time, I mean, I know your book has come out fairly recently, if there's been any reaction to your ideas in your book from a Chinese readership, if people have commented.
Well, Alison, thank you so much for asking. As I indicated, my Chinese friends and colleagues, senior figures in the Chinese Academy, have been immensely helpful. And it's really over, as again I say in the book, over really thousands of conversations with them that some of the ideas that are expressed in the book have been forged and formulated. The way I wanted some of the things that they would say to be the things that I would want to say, and you'll see on the back, one dear friend, senior figure, was happy to write an endorsement. I'm quite sure that others will. Whether they would do that quite as obviously, I don't know. But rest assured, in some ways, I'm trying to reflect here the quite extraordinary engagement with some of these themes within the Chinese Academy and give voice to them so they're better known in the West.
I look forward to reading it in more details. It's really quite fascinating.
Graham, live to tell the tale, as I said, so hopefully you will as well, Alison.
I will. I have a question from Stephen Green. What is the effect of urbanization on the Chinese cultural heritage? In the West, this has gone with radical secularization, at least in Europe. Is there any reason to believe, the same thing is happening in modern urban China?
In response to Lord Green, I think yes and no is my answer to that. Those enormous eastern seaboard cities, to which 300 million flocked over that 10-year period, the largest migration the world's ever seen. They were both major hubs of China's economic development. They're the powerhouses for new China. But of course, in those cities, we not only saw like this, the cutting edge of what we would imagine to be sort of Chinese secular ambition and those various faces of Chinese capitalism. But at the same time, we see in places like Wenzhou, one of those cities, an extraordinary manifestation of Christianity in large churches with Christian businesses operating much as the Cadburys and the Rowntrees did, looking after their workers well, from cradle to grave, giving them a secure context, a Christian context within which to flourish. So I don't think we can simply say urbanization and secularism therefore go together. There's plenty of a counter narrative to say those cities, the growth of the cities, have been places where both rural Christians have migrated and formed sometimes ethnically distinct communities of Christians together. Also, we see white collar churches, sometimes increasingly today under immense scrutiny and pressure, and nevertheless focuses for development of Christian identity. I hope that's something of an answer to Stephen's good question.
Thank you. We have another question from Ed Weech, our librarian. He says, what do you say to Lionel Jensen's notion that Confucianism was manufactured, he's put that in inverted commas, by the Jesuits?
Well, technically, of course, and he's technically right. You know, the very names were constructed by the Jesuits, which was not there before. I'm not sure if I would go so far as to say that China would ever allow anybody to come in with that sort of like controlling power. I think the way that Confucian ideas were communicated to the West brought some coherence, yes, but I think the raw materials were there, and I prefer to ascribe to the Chinese themselves a considerable care and almost protectiveness in the dialogue that we see from the very early 17th century. The Chinese know what they're doing, they know what they're talking about. They're very careful in the deliberateness of what they're willing to say yes and no to and maybe, and willing to explain more. So I think I probably would push back against Lionel Jensen's a little bit. I think we've always got to be aware, and I hope this comes through in the book, that we do not impose our Western frames on China, but rather let China speak to us and respond to that. Albeit sometimes, if you like, the data remains fragmented and fluid and problematic. The Western mind likes to compartmentalize and to order. That may not be the way, and certainly cultural studies doesn't permit us to do it. Things are more random, and we have to try and respond to the, if you like, inverted commas, the chaos of culture. And I think that's what we can see in that early experience. But thank you for the question. I look forward to meeting you.
Could I just add a point on that question and invite Chris to comment on that, just build on Ed's rather good question. And certainly it would be true that the Jesuits acted as the main transmitters of what they understood to be Confucianism back to the West, but their notions were seized upon by philosophers and others in the Enlightenment period, especially, to use Confucianism to interrogate their own societies. And they felt there were, in what they considered to be the Confucian way of ruling China, things that the Europeans ought to adopt and build into their own systems, which I think goes precisely to the kind of transmission that you have been talking about across a whole range of issues, Chris, does it not? It's the modification and the adaptation It isn't so much the creation of the creed, it's the application of it in their own society, to interrogate, to criticize as a mechanism for critiquing their own system. It's an example, in a way, of these archetypes at work.
I think the only thing I would add to that, in some ways, it's to affirm Jensen's point, which in a way is that, as the book explains, albeit in passing, Ricci's focus was on what we would call, if like, the classical core of Confucianism. And it was that he was committed to ensuring the West understood. He was aware, as every student of Confucianism is, that Confucianism has been a dynamic tradition and prepared more than Christianity perhaps to move away from its founding figure. But when it came to encapsulating this, Ricci, I think, very pragmatically said, I want to go to the heart of this and to look at those classic texts. And in a way, I think I was inspired to focus on the analects for that very reason. We can do this, and by doing that, we begin to understand the basis for dialogue more clearly than if we allow ourselves to pick up the journey further down the road, as it were, which is more problematic.
Right, thank you. We have another question. Were there any Confucian agents from China to the West in the same way that there were Christian missionaries to China in history? And how about the role of the Confucius Institute at present, and now? So there's two questions there, in fact. Yeah.
Yes, there were famous visitor, the first, and not this. There were many Chinese visitors to the West over a very long period of time, and we can rightly assume, I think, that the cultural semiotics, if you like, or the semaphores which they carried were Confucian, courtly representatives, imperial representatives coming to the Pope, and etc. And then, of course, the famous instance of Michael Shen, who came to Oxford, whose portrait was painted, famously met with Anthony Wood. There were figures like this who were prominent within in the 17th century and began to be icons of this new opening up of China to the West, at least in that next phase, which becomes so important. And that is part of the beginning of what I touched on, which is the burgeoning of 17th century British sinophilia. The Royal Society was birthed in sinophilia, this quest to understand porcelain, the use of Jesuit materials by Wedgwood and others, which I talk about in the book. This is absolutely foundational for this incredible 150 years when Britain and Europe too were completely besotted with China. Now, what happened is that over a period of time, interest waned, conflict developed, critical voices came in, suspicions of the Chinese system began to be voiced and raised, and so little by little, the shine went off, and by the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, animosity in a substantial way sets in, and it really was those Protestant missionaries who began to come back and really be those who loved China, while other people were either disregarding it or dismissing it critically. And I think that's something which we need to honor in different ways. And as to the Confucius Institute, well, they've been a little controversial, as we know. For some, it's been a rather unfortunate expression of China's attempt at exercise of soft power. I've had quite a lot of fruitful conferences with folk who've worked in the Confucius Institutes and understand that they have been one of the ways, particularly during that very, very positive phase from like early 2000s through to about 2010, when there was an openness. And I think we missed that. I think the West was slow. It was slow to understand the authentic hand of friendship which was being held out. Confucian institutes were one of the ways that was being held out to the West. But alas, that story has gone a little sour, and opportunity missed.
Right. Thank you. We've just got a few more, and then we'll take you off the hook. On soft power, this is from Tony Friend, who he's talking about China's soft power. Don't you see them using economic and financial weight to influence, for example, Africa in recent years? I suppose asking you to comment on that, the Chinese influence in Africa.
Tony, absolutely. I made just passing reference to it when I talked about the building of hospitals in Africa and other philanthropic initiatives. One of the things we monitor in all sorts of places around the world is what we would call preemptive philanthropy, where you come in and sweeten folk and then may have another agenda. So yes, there has been really a substantial use or attempt to use these. And I was looking at the numbers of people who've been given scholarships to study in China from in Chinese universities, not least from the African continent. And I think what I'd come back to say, how successful has this been? I just wonder if in some ways there have been receptors who've been willing to say, thanks very much for your money. We hear what you're saying. We'll go along with this, but we don't like Chinese culture. So in some ways that quest to exercise soft power has been less successful. And I think the Chinese have sometimes believed the hope that you can buy loyalty, the hope you can buy love, buy respect, I think is misplaced. And I think that is what we are seeing.
And then we have just one question. How can your book best contribute to the approach of the former Australian Prime Minister and the President of the Asia Society? By that, I think is meant Kevin Rudd's managed strategic competition approach between China and the US.
That's taking me slightly beyond where the book has gone, but let me see if I can say something sensible. The first thing, of course, is to register the significance of Australia in the Quad and in the substantial discussions at the present time about Southeast Asian collaboration. China, in many ways, Australia, in many ways, is one of those, probably still want to call Western nations, but or being willing to engage deeply with the West in its engagement with this particular phase of China. I would hope very much that the collaboration of, don't we say, democratic powers around the world will sensibly look not to understand China deeply and not to believe some of the caricatures that are widely projected, and I think unhelpfully so. I wouldn't like people to live off a caricature of me. I'm sure they do, but I wouldn't like that. And I don't blame the Chinese if they get pretty fed up, as they were, I think, very deeply at certain points over the last 40 years by this projection onto them of certain things that were in many ways simply not true. The West was wanting China to be something that it wasn't. And the demonizing, I think, at critical moments was really very unhelpful indeed. That's not to say, it's not in any sense to underestimate how serious, I think, the situation's come in China global relations in the last few years. And that's a cause of great dismay and heartache to those of us who love China and have worked deeply and engaged deeply there. But so all strength to those who look for constructive ways of engaging, I would say.
Right, well, we'll go for the last question, extending Ed's question on was Confucianism manufactured by the Jesuits? This is from Ritz, who says, I might be mixing up the epochs, but is there any evidence that the Confucianisms were always intermingled and actively engaged with the Taoisms and other local isms in a similar way to how Buddhists and Hindus were always in dialogue, and were only later, upon impact with outsiders, categorized as two different belief systems.
I think that's a very, very interesting point, and it would take a long time to carefully chart what we're talking about when we talk about Confucianism. I deliberately grounded my work in the texts because that, as I said, that gives some sort of shape. I'm very aware that rather like a pyramid, sometimes used in describing these things, there's a center which is very clear, and then there are points which are much more broadly cast. And at those points in Chinese culture, popular culture, as we know, there's a blurring and a blending of Confucian and Taoist and Buddhist, and if you like, just popular religious superstitions. Part of, I think, the task of those of us who try and keep an eye on this, the spiritual dimension to Chinese culture, is to study this hybrid phenomenon at the bottom of the pyramid, recognizing though that there are points at which there is a pure form, as a purer form, and that is to be found in the classical texts, and it's with those, if you like, that I wanted to focus my own work. But I know other scholarly friends spend much more time looking at the diverse hybrid expressions of Chinese popular religion and ritual as it's expressed in village fates and events like that. And that it's another task. It wasn't my task, important task that it is. But thank you for that reminder to recognize that. So thank you very much.
Well, I think we've come to the end, and I would just really like to thank everyone for attending, and of course the flyer for the discount on the book. I would also like to thank Christopher and Graham really for really posing such thought-provoking questions that will occupy me, I think, tonight. And I'm really very sorry that we're now not able to adjourn for a nice glass of wine and to reflect on all these interesting points that came up tonight in more depth. So thank you, everybody. And thank you very much, Christopher, and thank you very much, Graham. Really, it was tremendous, really interesting launch. And Matty will save you the comments that are coming through now on the chat, which you'll be able to look at later.
Thank you.
So thank you. And it sort of does work on Zoom, doesn't it? All right.
Thank you, Alison, for having us. Wonderful.
Not at all. It was absolute pleasure. And thank you very much indeed, really. And thank you to everybody for attending. Good night. Thank you.
Right.